starting recording, and we will get started. So again, welcome to week three, and just going back as to where we've been before. So, are you okay there, Doug?
Yep.
Okay. So just with week one, week two, week three, again, intentionally working backwards. And one of the big reasons of working backwards is, in some respects, working backwards is kind of chronological in terms of the order in which the stories were written, not necessarily the order in which the stories were included. And the other piece is by doing it in reverse, it kind of disrupts the rhythm that we're normally used to, and then helping us to hear something that might be too familiar in a new way. And so that's very intentional of working backwards. And so, of course, today we're on the flood, and then we take a week's break, and then on May 24th we jump. So we're not working entirely backwards. We're working, but we sort of jump ahead, or sort of jump back to the beginning of the story of the Garden of Eden, and then move forward, and then that's next week, that's 2 weeks from now, and the week after that, because we deal mostly with the garden, the man and the woman, and what is sometimes referred to as original sin. And then we are working. Then we do Cain and Abel the following week, and then we jump to the very beginning of the book, to what we sometimes refer to as the Great Prologue. And so that's where we're headed now. So I just want to make sure that we're kind of into it. Now, just doing a bit of a recap last week. I'm not going to spend too much time in it, but mostly if there was any questions that kind of popped up from last week. One of the big things is a reminder, is that Genesis specifically is among, well, not specifically, but among other things, is a compilation of what is referred to as etiological stories. In other words, origin and meaning. And we actually cover some of that tonight in very, very specific terms. Just in terms of how to understand the world and making sense of it, and putting the story of the people into the world in relation to God. And the other reminder is the word myth is not a bad word. It means foundational origin story, regardless of whether it's true or false. Well, and false is not the right term, whether it's historically true or not, whether it's historically accurate. I think that'd be a better way to put it. And so that's one thing to kind of to really keep in mind. Myth is not a bad word, because at its best, myth tells us about ourselves, and the stories that we tell about ourselves is very, very important for understanding who we are. And so that's what I want to try and convey with that. Now, again, I keep harping on this, and I will say this every single time, and it actually is particularly, like, as with last week, it was relevant last week, it's very relevant this week, is to think inside the dome. In other words, put your mindset not on the cosmic background that I have behind me, but more in the idea of as people perceive the world as a snow globe. And so that's, I mean, snow globe is a real oversimplification, but if we have that kind of picture in our mind, then a lot of the images from many different parts of the Bible, not just Genesis, begin to make more sense. Rather than trying to understand it from like this, we can actually put spacecraft up and see this. They did not have that benefit. And so, especially when understanding the flood, is how we understand Hebrew cosmology, how they understand the world to work. And it also helps in terms of how they understood the flood to have happened. So again, here's the dome. And just as a reminder of all the different parts of it. And I want you to pay attention specifically to the waters under the earth and the waters above the earth for today. And you can pay attention to the firmament as well, because the dome, because we're going to be talking a bit about that. So, and I'm just going to make sure that I've got this open to do a quick reference to it as we start working our way through it. So, all right. So starting at just having chapter 6 open. The other thing is we're also going to be talking about oral tradition. Now, keep in mind, in early cultures, stories were transmitted orally, and it wasn't like secretive that one person told one other person, they told another person in the broken telephone line. What they did is storytelling is always community oriented. It happens in a group. And so when you tell a story in a group, people get up and start to tell the stories. And if someone gets some of the facts wrong, the group will correct them. And that's one of the ways of keeping an oral tradition consistent rather than doing that. But they also have easy to remember formulas as ways to remember. We talked about that last week with the Tower of Babel. It also is true of the story of the flood. And so that's going to be that's also part of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And the reason that we have them is that when you tell stories orally, rather than reading them either personally or out loud, is that by doing this, it provides anchor points to make things easier. I mean, last week I used the example of a 3-point joke where you have three individuals, and I mean, there's dozens and dozens, well, hundreds of jokes that we tell in that sense. Use the 3-person format, that there's 3 individuals. There's two actions that are similar, and then the third line creates the punchline. That is an oral tradition that it has survived into the modern period, because I've seen very few jokes written down, but I can tell you the one thing about being clergy is, especially when I was first ordained, I would go to weddings and people would then begin to regale me with every clergy joke they knew. And I heard them all. And so it's kind of like, tell me if you've heard this one before. I've heard it, and they proceed to tell it to me anyway. And so there's a lot of that kind of thing, but it's usually this kind of almost a 3-point thing. There's a reason why some ministers, I had a mentor who only ever preached a 3-point sermon, and he would announce what his 3 points were at the beginning. He'd give the 3 points and then reiterate what they were every time. He didn't deviate from it at all. 3 points in a poem. And part of that is people were able to remember, and that to that benefit. And so these memorization formulas are carried into their written forms. So again, just as a reminder, the modern storytelling is you either have a book and you read it to yourself, or at best, like in the way that we do, say, a children's story, there's still someone holding a book and reading it to a group, but the book is the primary means of delivery. In oral traditions, it's usually done around a community setting. Quite often, campfire stories, for example, is the way that we often do that. But the stories are told at community gatherings with a group of people. And so that's what these are written forms of that kind of storytelling, as opposed to a written book, because a lot of this just predates all of this. So here's the question: how old is the story of the flood? At least and this is a very complex question that I'm hoping to give you just a little bit of a glimpse into how old the story of the flood actually is. In its written form, it first appeared specifically in the biblical form that we have now. The first versions of it appeared around the time of King David, about roughly 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. The current version that we have in the Bible dates to about the 6th century BC, approximately, in and around the time of the exile. Now, the thing is, there are, if anybody ever tells you that the Bible is not inconsistent, well, I'm going to burst your bubble big time tonight, and we're going to have fun doing it. Okay, and please, please do take this. It's intentional, but to show you the diversity and the depth and the development of this story as we have it now. So let's talk about some of what those inconsistencies actually are, because they're there. And so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and you might think you know the answer, and the answer is you may not be. So in what numbers did animals go into the ark?
Well, that's changes all the time.
Yeah.
Because so in chapter 6, I guess it's the Lord at this point says, get all of them. Mm-hmm. And then in 7, he says, I just want you to get these guys.
Yep.
And then I have,
yeah. And if they're good, 7 can go, and otherwise 2, but every, male and female only.
Yeah.
But what's a pair of the animals that are not clean?
Well, for example, pigs are an example of an unclean animal.
Okay, so, and then you only get to have 7 pairs of the birds of the air.
Mm-hmm. So you've noticed that all the animals went in 2 by 2. Well, in fact, that is a close reading. In fact, that's not the case. That it has them going in pairs, groups of 7. How many that they get? It seems to be more. It's not really consistent.
But you know what? That number 7 and then that number 40 come up again, don't they?
They do. And that's kind of part of that. We have, so largely we can break it into sort of two separate things, but it is a little bit more complex. So we have animals going in by pairs, or we have clean animals going in a group of 7 and pairs of everything else. So there's one. How many days did it rain?
7. Oh, there was something about a 7 there. I know it's 40 days.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, but I thought you were taught 40 days and 40 nights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the thing is, that's the most consistent answer that we have. But if you look on a careful reading, 150 days in Genesis chapter 7, verse 24. So that's one. And where are we here?
Waters were on.
Yep, the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days.
Well,
and then
that's because the flood waters hadn't receded till 150 years.
Well, that's if the thing is, they swelled up. That's a little what's called a cognitive dissonance construct that we create, that the waters were still swelling. The whole point is they were swelling. The water was coming down for 150 days, because that kind of nuance is not present in the Hebrew. But we also have that the whole flood lasted, in chapter 8, verse 13. It lasted a whole year. But at that point, that's when the waters are receding. Mm-hmm. After a year. So, and also, what kind of bird was sent out?
Dove. What's it mean?
Okay,
I thought it was the dove.
you're not wrong, but the first bird that was sent out was a raven,
Oh, yeah, that's right.
and then immediately after that, a dove. And the thing is, this one is probably the most integrated because like the raven is sent out and the raven doesn't come back, and then the dove is sent out and then the dove comes back with something in its beak. And but here, this is the pattern in and of itself is that as the waters recede or as things lighten up, a bird is sent out. So what we have is also the question is, and how is God referred to? And here's some overlap. Because what you have is that God is referred to as the Lord 5 times, and here are the verse references for where that is. But then God is referred to as God or as Elohim 12 times, and here are all the references. And notice carefully here that there is only overlap in one verse, and that is in verse 7, chapter 7, verse 16. And it's both, but if you look carefully, it's actually 2 completely different sentences. Even though in probably the New Revised Standard Version puts a comma there, in the Hebrew itself, it's actually 2 different sentences. So, what this is starting to tell us is actually giving us a picture, is that we have the different names of God, like God's proper name, Yahweh, or God, Elohim, is used in different sections of the story, and it helps outline the different elements. And a little closer study will associate the certain use of language with how many days it rained or how long it rained versus and they tend to line up in a group. And so the question is, what do the inconsistencies mean? And scholars have come to the conclusion that in fact what you have is not one story but several layered on top of each other. So you have at least 2, probably 3 or 4 tellings of the flood story that have been integrated together. And so that's what the inconsistencies mean, because modern editing techniques that would make that seamless didn't really exist then, particularly in writing. You'd kind of have like 4 different things out in front of you, and the person who's editing it would just simply straight up copy them verbatim into the sections. The only thing that they are doing editing wise is just lining them up approximately, but not trying to smooth out those differences. Modern editing techniques have come into play, whereas that was definitely not in play. And we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. So what we have is multiple sources, multiple tellings of the flood story integrated together. And each of them have their own theological take or flavor in the telling of the story of trying to understand or reflecting upon the story of the flood. And so the final layer, it dates to about the time that Genesis, as we now have it, came, crystallized. And that final layer dates to about the 6th century, and it's addressing specific issues, more specifically in relation to Babylon. And that's going to be something that we come back to. So now the only thing is that Noah's Ark, of course, is the best known of what is called a flood story within our own culture. It is not the only one. That in fact there are many similar stories in other cultures. And I'm going to take you on a brief tour of some of those different flood stories. And so it appears to be that even at the time of the original, like the earliest form of Genesis, there were flood stories in circulation in the Near East, and they were not limited to the Bible. They were not limited to the kingdom of King David. They were not limited to that area. In fact, even though it's the best known, if you do a search, also there are people who are trying to find Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. You know in Mount Ararat is at least in its modern sense is in modern day Turkey. So in the Anatolia, or what is referred to as Anatolia, but what we now understand as Turkey, probably just north of, like directly north of the eastern Mediterranean. And there are groups that are actually dedicated to physically finding Noah's Ark. Now, knowing what I know about this, this is not the best use of resources, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to prove the story of the Ark to be literally true, and yet there are some issues with that, because there are also multiple accounts of flood stories from around the world. And the oldest written one that we have is actually from Mesopotamia, which is in the areas just to the northeast of where Israel is today. And so the oldest of these is referred to as Gilgamesh. How many of you have heard of the Gilgamesh epic? Okay. The Gilgamesh epic is an ancient text. It's I believe Sumerian in origin, but I think some of the accounts that we have are written in Akkadian or Akkadian that I described last week as far as language. But in it, there is a story of a character by the name of Utnapishtim, who is also the gods command him to gather up animals into a boat because there is going to be a flood, and gathers them up and carries them to safety. Now that's in a place that is fairly close to, and it actually predates the first written accounts in the Bible by 900 years or more. We also have the story of Atlantis is actually a flood story in and of itself. There are Greek and Roman flood accounts where Zeus and Jupiter, in their respective roles, there is a flood. There is also flood stories in Norse mythology. In Celtic flood, there are Celtic flood myths. But it's not just in Europe and the Near East. There is also a North American connection out here on the coast. How many of you have been to the Vancouver airport? Okay. There is a large sculpture in the Vancouver airport. I'm assuming it's still there. Okay, it's called the Spirit of Haida Gwaii. And it even got billing on our $20 bill. And see all the animals on a boat. That is called the Spirit of Haida Gwaii. It is a Haida story.
8 o'clock.
It is pardon me. It's the story in a Western North American First Nations culture of flood, and it's also a flood story. And as you can see, similarly, you have someone gathering up animals on a boat.
Mhm.
So there are flood stories from across the world. And so the story of Noah is clearly linked to these other flood stories that are immediately around Israel. But it also seems to be that there's this kind of cultural echo of it. And it's probably therefore drawing from a much, much, much older story. And a story from the distant past, that there comes trying to come to an understanding of whatever this event was in the past, or events, and what you now have is a theological reflection on why this happened. Now, that having been said, despite what creationists might tell you, there is no geological evidence of a flood as described in Genesis. In other words, basically the water's literally covering everything around the world. There is not enough water in the Earth's atmosphere to do that, period. Okay. There is not, but I'm gonna put an interesting caveat on that. Just hold on to that thought. There's no evidence for something like that. But the thing is, when you have so many different flood stories coming from so many different places, there's a question, well, they've got to come from someplace. Something happened. And so what may actually happen here is something referred to as a racial memory. In other words, something that is really, really, really old. And so this is somewhat speculative, is that 1 million years ago was the last great ice age that covered the entire like where we are in North America was covered in ice, and those ice sheets came right down into the middle of North America. Same thing from the south, that in the ice age, that the Earth was a whole lot cooler during this particular period, and these glaciers covered everything. But here's the other thing is that the greatest of these extent of these glaciers is 20,000 years ago. So on a geologic, that's a long time ago for us, but on a geological scale, that's actually not very long ago at all. But here's the interesting thing is during this time, sea levels would have been 450 feet lower than they are now. So just consider that. So that means between 20,000 years ago and in more recent history, sea levels rose 450 feet. And so the most recent events of the melting finished approximately 6,000 years ago, which is, again, not that long ago. I mean, and so what you have is that as the glaciers retreated, they melted, and there was a fairly slow and steady melt. But there were occasional times when that melting actually caused what would have been cataclysmic, just straight up cataclysmic flooding. And so here's a couple of examples, and these are actually geologically have been geologically noted. That there was a flood in the northwestern United States and North America, where there were basically what happens is you get a buildup of water behind an ice dam, and then the ice melts, and then finally breaks, and all that water comes out. And so there is some evidence of a melt where that seems to have happened, where you basically have the equivalent of an ocean washing over land, and it did happen more than once. But here's something else: the shores of the Black Sea, and this puts it more into the area. So of course, the Black Sea right now is very much on people's minds because of the conflict in Ukraine. But during the Ice Age, the Black Sea would have been a freshwater lake, and as sea levels rose, there would have been trickling down some of the rivers. But you have the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, getting higher and higher and higher. And then it reaches the level of what is now the Bosphorus. And eventually the water from that just suddenly spills over, breaking whatever sort of land dam and forced erosion. And you actually have the filling of the Black Sea. That happened approximately about a little over 7,000 years ago, in terms of that event. So this probably, as an event, is the most likely candidate for the various flood stories that we have in the Near East. Not just the story of Noah, but also what is in Gilgamesh and some of the Greek stories, that people would be telling stories of this in an oral tradition, carrying it forward of a great flood, and presumably the scrambling of people trying to get everything to safety, including animals. So again, regardless of the origins, each culture that was telling this story adapted the culture and began to tell the story with doing reflection on their culture of the time. And the biblical account is no different. So now we're going to get into the theology rather than saying what actually happened. Now we're actually going to get into why was it included. So what we have in the flood stories, we actually have three separate stories. We have Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8, which is the preamble. We actually have the story of Noah and the flood itself, and then we have the sons of Noah. These are actually three different stories that have been kind of strung together in Genesis as we presently have it. And so what we want to do is do a very, very quick look at Genesis chapter 6. This is chapter 6. This is presented, at least in here, this is the why. Why did God cause a flood? And in this case, but the thing is, it's presented as the leading cause, but it's actually, the curious thing is that there are other ancient sources that are separate from the Great Flood, but this seems to have been included here as the reason for the Great Flood. But where it exists elsewhere, it is not the reason for the Great Flood. But this is the story of angels and human beings breeding and producing giants. At least that seems to be what the implication is. But it's been edited heavily. And it seems to be that the origins of it seems to be almost pornographic to the culture, that it was edited down. But the thing is, again, this was told around campfires and community gatherings, and so what we have in terms of that origins, it gives the rationale for it. But you can actually consider it separate from the actual flood story itself. So what we want to do is, looking back here, is that we do actually have an insight into a greater depth. That there is something called the Book of Enoch, which in Coptic Christian traditions they consider it to be canonical. But it's easy enough to find. Of course, it's not in our Bibles. It's not in you won't find it in the Apocrypha. But if you have a Coptic or an Ethiopian Bible, chances are you will find the Book of Enoch in there, and it's easy enough to look up. These days with the internet, you could have a copy, and you could probably open up a new window and go find it while I'm sitting here nattering away. But again, it's the idea is that you have this story of angels interbreeding with women, with the offspring referred to as Nephilim, so often referred to as the giants. But that's not quite accurate. But it seems to be, there was something very offensive about it in a way that we culturally cannot understand. That this may have been a way to kind of kill it off, and by attaching it to Noah, say, but the flood happened, and so they're all gone. So let's not talk about that anymore. But when we actually get into the actual story of the flood. Here, remember last week we had the pattern of A, B, C, C, D, A. Well, here we have A, B, C, D, D, B, C, B, A as a pattern. And so what happens is that God is not happy with creation. And so says, I will now, I'm not happy with this, I'm going to blot it out. So tells Noah specifically, but I'm going to rescue a few people plus some animals. So Noah, go build an ark. So Noah does as he's told, and he goes ahead and he fills the ark, and he fills the ark, and it rains. Now, here's the interesting thing: in a lot of theatrical examinations of the telling of the story of Noah, or even some comedic ones from the now disgraced Bill Cosby, for example, you have people making fun of Noah making the ark. Now, I want to know how many of us have actually built that into our understanding of the reading, that Noah was made fun of for building the ark. Because the thing is, if you do look carefully, there doesn't seem to be any sort of there doesn't seem to be any sort of scene where neighbors are coming up and making fun of him for building this big monstrosity. So what we have is God's not happy with creation, says, I'm going to blot it out. Noah, go build the ark. Noah says, sure, I'll fill the ark. And then the waters of the sky and the deep are unleashed. Now, remember that snow globe I was telling you about. What happens is not only does it rain from above, and what happens isn't so much rain as in God opens the door in the dome and lets all the water that's up there come down and fill. And not only that, also God pushes up the water from the waters of under the earth. So it's not just rain, but it's also stuff being pushed up in the story. The waters are unleashed, and water in Hebrew culture is in essence the embodiment of chaos. It's the absolute embodiment of chaos, and so do keep that in mind. Is that embodiment of chaos is very much a part and parcel of that. It's the word in Hebrew is tehom, the great and terrible deep. And I think I actually bring up that as a Hebrew word in a bit. And then, as the story progresses, it reverses. The waters are unleashed, they do their thing, and then the waters are restrained. They find land, and the ark gets emptied. Noah worships God, and then God takes his bow and places it into the sky. And this is the etiological story of the rainbow. Why are there rainbows? Because God is reminding us that God will never of what happened in the story of the flood, but God will never destroy the earth again. That's the sign of the rainbow. And so there's that little etiological story as to why do we have rainbows. I mean, that is curiously enough one of the purposes of telling the story of Noah is a remind. It became a way for people to be reminded of this story. Now, the ark itself is a place of refuge. The Hebrew word for it is exactly the same word that is used for the basket in which Moses gets placed in Exodus. It's the same word. So, take that parallel as you like, because Moses is placed in the river in a tibah. And so the origins of that word probably are may actually be Egyptian. That's found its way in, but I have to check because it may still be a Semitic word in and of itself that's common to a number of the Semitic languages there, or it could be Egyptian. So remember, this part I kind of jumped ahead and I covered already, is that the doors of heaven opened and all the water from up here flows down. Might have washed some stars down with while they were at it. And also the fountains of the deep are unleashed, and the word deep, tehom. I'm a little geeking out about this, and I get to come back at this at the same time. But this is tehom is linked to a Babylonian it's linguistically linked to the description of a great ancient dragon called Tiamat, which is known in Babylonian Sumerian mythology. But in essence, this creature is the embodiment of chaos, and in Hebrew, it's linguistically tied to it. That Tehom is representative of the deep, but it also embodies chaos itself. That the deep waters of chaos are unleashed. And here's a couple things to keep in mind. The early Judaism were mountain people. They were not seafarers at all. They left that to the Phoenicians. The high and it's one of the reasons why a lot of the theology, high mountains are good places because it's well away from the sea. And so the fear of the water was significant in the culture. But what you have in the story is not just the waters. You have the waters from above and the waters from below being unleashed. So it all settles down. The bow is in the clouds, and then we have this epilogue, which is a separate story in and of itself. And what we have to do is realize in this part, God isn't even here at all. God is not present at all, it seems, in these verses. And so it seems to be more of an origin story about, and a comment about the people that in the other Semitic cultures that the ancient Hebrews would interact with, specifically on the people of Canaan. And so this is Canaan being the son of Ham. So that's just more of a brief comment on that. Now, what we want to do is talk about themes, the themes about the flood. Though, what are some of the themes? What are some of the expressions of our relationship with God with the flood? And one of them is creation itself. That in fact, the story of Noah's Ark is in fact a third creation story. If you count Genesis chapter 1 as creation story number 1, and the story of the Garden of Eden as being creation story number 2, Noah in fact is creation story number 3, because effectively the world starts anew as part of this. And so, and this is actually fairly consistent with early cultures in this. So having multiple creation stories rather than just, well, which one is it? The idea is that there were actually multiple ones. And in this case, you actually had the stringing together of several dominant ones at the time that people would have been familiar with. That the people who brought Genesis together were trying to give all of them the airtime that they deserve. So it is reasonable, it is a good way to describe it, that the story of Noah's Ark is a creation story. But it's also a story of promise and foreshadowing of God's covenant. Is the idea is that we have that Noah responded to God and brought people to safe, or brought his family and nature to safety through this experience, the experience of the flood. And also, again, as I mentioned before, the etiology or the origins, as people understood it, as the rainbow, as opposed to the way that scientifically that I've been explaining to my son, that the rainbow is refracted and reflected light, and that light in of itself is filled with many colors. But it's also good to tell, we tell the story of the rainbow to remind us of God's mercy. God's love, God's mercy, God's salvation in the middle of a crisis like this. But also, one of the other reasons why it was included is that because this was written in its current form around the time of the exile, is that people would have been exposed to the epic and the story of Gilgamesh at the time during the exile. That well, we have this story too, but it was Gilgamesh. And it was asserting that in fact that it was God's central role in the story of the flood, as opposed to anything from the Babylonian mythology or the Babylonian stories that they would have told. But also, again, the supremacy of God over creation. That what we have here is there's a transition point where it's more that you have the transition between God being a local deity for one people to, in fact, the creator of all things. And this was an important theological point that was made, is because not so much like the story itself is very old, but its inclusion at the time that Genesis in its present form came together was sharing with people that in fact God is in control. God is in control of all of this. Even though we are in exile, we're away from our home, the temple's been destroyed, God is still in control. And not only that, God is in control, and there is an end to the flood, and there is redemption beyond it. And so that would be another reason for including the story, because the cataclysm of the flood and being able to step beyond it would be something that would definitely have resonated. And so and not only that, not only is God in control, but God is in control of the very thing that they feared the most. And like I said, this was a culture that did not like the water. Seas were terrible places filled with horrible monsters. And and that's why one actually you have to go up of that Jerusalem is effectively built on a mountain. So keep that in mind. The further away we get from the sea, the better. And that's actually one of the reasons why the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, which is not part of what we're dealing with in this, is so seminally important in the development of the identity, that you actually have the waters being parted, and they can go through on dry land. The chaos is separated, and they can go through freedom. So at this point, any questions? We're just hitting the 1 hour mark. I know that when David's here, for example, we tend to get a few more questions. I just want to see where we're at. And I realized I burned through this pretty quickly, but I'm allotted here until 8:30. So whatever questions you want to ask, or you want me to go back and review, I'm more than happy to do that.
One of the things that you asked us to do was to read it through and just see how many, like, when is he referred to as God, and when is he referred to as Lord?
Yeah.
So I might have missed that because I had an important phone call to take. Did you already go over that?
I did, but let me just pull it back up. Um,
It's
Uh,
15.
it's sort of, let's see, it's in the, okay, bird.
I noticed that
Yeah.
in chapter 6,
Hmm.
it says, before this flood, the sons of God, the Lord said
Yes.
afterward.
Yeah.
So sons of God,
Hmm.
but then the Lord said
Yes.
that he was unhappy with what he had done.
Yes. And in this case, the sons of God in this particular case is actually, and it's translated as the sons of God. Sometimes it's referred to as the angels.
So angels are sons and daughters are not?
That has more to do with like the one thing about English does not have as much reliance on gendered language, say like French does. And Hebrew does have that as well. And actually, I have, sorry for I have my copy of let's see, let's check this out in Genesis. So that's Genesis chapter 6, verse 2. I just want to see what it says in the Hebrew.
Sons of God, so the daughters and other humans were beautiful. But
Yeah.
it sounds like there were a lot of people around before this flood.
Oh yeah, and like
And they were very bad. How bad were they? I think we're bad now. Like,
yeah. Well, and the thing is that you know, like, what was the population of the world at that point in time? Well, that's very hard to say, because what you're dealing with is you're dealing with, it's the theological reasoning for you know, you're having the theological reasoning and understanding for the flood. And in this particular case, keep in mind that story about the angels and the angels effectively breeding with humanity to create the Nephilim. That's actually completely separate from the story of the flood in and of itself, but it's placed into the Bible where it is here as a justification for it, of the flood. It becomes a theological reason for it, but as a story, it's actually it's actually independent. Now, I was looking this up. Here we are. Okay, 6:1 verse 2.
So while you're doing that, why does it say the sons of God, but the daughters of men?
Yes. So when it says the sons of God, I'm just looking at the Hebrew, and even though it says the sons of God, the implication is just reading the Hebrew is ha. It says ha Elohim, which tends to like the phrasing in there seems to be it's more in reference to divine beings under God, but not necessarily. So they're not necessarily sons of God, but they are divine beings that have kind of gone rogue, so to speak.
Oh,
and so
a very weird translation then, because we're supposed to be honoring God.
yeah, and it's very, like, the thing is, it's also a difficult translation, because the other thing that has been noted about that particular story is that it seems to be like what we know from, for example, from the story of Enoch, that actually gives a little bit more detail, so to speak. That what you have here is that the actual implication of the story has been partially erased linguistically in terms of the telling of the story, and so there's another layer under there that of what that is. It's not something that is as obvious, like it's more if you actually can read the Hebrew, it seems to be, it's referencing the story that people know,
Mm.
but they're using very euphemistic language to tell it. And so therefore, a lot of the meaning gets obscured for those of us who may not have been sort of in the know at the time.
Mhm.
But also keep in mind, this is presented as the justification for the flood, even though the story in and of itself is actually separate. Like there's a flood story, there's what happens after the flood with the sons of Noah, and there's this story. These are actually three different stories that the writers of the current form of or the editors of the current form of Genesis brought together and put together in a lot.
Mm.
Okay. So I don't know if that necessarily helps. Now, I wanted to find, because I did have you look at how God is referred to.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to find that slide. Here we are. So we just coming back to this, we have God is referred to as the Lord, as Yahweh,
Yeah.
5 times, and that's in chapter 7. And chapter 8, and then you have God referred to as Elohim. And notice in this list, chapter 6, verse 2 is not referenced in this list at all, and that's because when it says the sons of God, that's the implication in there. Unfortunately, it's translated for us a little too literally. That should read in the probably more divine beings, but that is a sort of a literal translation.
So does Elohim mean like any divine being, but Lord mean the one that we celebrate?
Yes. Well, okay. Specifically, the Lord, Yahweh, is God's proper name in terms of whom we worship.
Yeah.
Elohim can reference God as in capital G, God, as we, I mean, that's often the language that I tend to use more often. But Elohim is actually the I am in the im at the end of a word in Hebrew is naturally plural. It's kind of like putting s on it. Okay, so
Therefore, it could be all kinds of spirits.
but it does also refer to as God singular, but God is inherently plural. So when we talk about God, that usually in Hebrew it is God is referred to as like when we see God, the word is Elohim, which can mean God singular or ineffable, in all of God's majesty, or it can also mean lowercase God's plural.
Oh. Okay.
And it can mean both. And the challenge is trying to discern carefully when one is reading which one is implied. And usually by context, you can usually figure that out. For example, when the phrase other gods, often it's the qualifying word other,
Yeah.
Elohim. And then that or strange gods or something akin to that.
Okay,
So
so what was it with the
context
rainbow?
matters.
What was it
Pardon
with the
me?
rainbow? In the rainbow, the promise of the rainbow,
Yes,
did they use Lord or God?
good point. Let me just quickly look that up.
And while you're doing that, also think of at the beginning, wasn't it that was the Lord that said that he was upset that he had created us?
Yes.
or them or whatever.
Well, so chapter 6, verse 3, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in these mortals forever, for they are flesh, their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, the sons of God, then we have that whole sex bit there. And they were the heroes of old and warriors of renown. The Lord saw the wickedness of humanity or humankind was great in the earth, that every inclination and the thoughts of their hearts was only on evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made humankind on the earth and grieved into his heart. And so this is like all the way through this. This is Yahweh, 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 through all that. So, and so that points to it being a much older text.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was under the understanding when they referred to the Lord, it was at a 1,000 years before, and then God was 500 or 600 by the different people writing. It was a different age.
Yeah, and the main thing is, like, don't get too hung up on years and length of days. But clearly this, the chapter 6 is an early one. But curiously enough, when that Noah builds this, when it's all said and done, Noah comes out, builds an altar, and pulls out some of those clean animals that he took 7 on board, because the whole reason that he did that is because then he did a sacrifice at the end of it, and this odor goes up, and specifically here it's built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal of every clean bird and offered a burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled it, the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart, inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done for as long as the earth endures. There's that section, I'll never do it again, but then it suddenly changes gears in the beginning of chapter 9. All of a sudden it switches immediately to God.
Yeah.
Chapter 9, verse 1.
So,
And so what we have is a newer reflection, and it said, okay, and again it iterates again, I will never do this again. And then at this point it's God who places the bow in the cloud. So we have, I'll never do this, boy, that smells great, I'll never do this again. And then it's almost like retelling the story again, but it's, as God is referred to, places his bow and let this be a sign and a reminder
So
of this story, because I don't see the word the word the Lord does not appear anywhere in chapter 9.
Okay.
So we have a sort of book, a small little bookend with the whole altar bit, but then we have this more extended the talking about I'll never do this again, and here's my bow in the clouds.
well, it makes me realize that these, the different religions where they only go by one thing in the Bible, and that's gospel, and they can't do anything different. You don't know who wrote what. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, part of it, like all traditions have a certain degree of what we refer to as a canon within a canon. Canon generally means what we refer to as is the term that we tend to refer to as the totality of scripture. but every tradition, whether it's Eastern Orthodox, Coptic, and Roman Catholic, or the multitude of Protestant denominations, will tend to gravitate towards certain texts, and will do so at certain periods of time. It'll evolve over time. Like, for example, I remember attending United Churches when I was 6 years old, and at the time, the fishers of men was a phrase that was used a lot at the time that I remember, and that's something that isn't necessarily used as much anymore, because just over like certain periods of time where certain stories kind of raise up or come down. I mean, just and sometimes, yeah, like certain groups will just kind of stick to one particular one, as opposed to looking at the totality of the story. And I mean, in this case, what you actually have in the story of the flood is you've got this effort to bring together multiple different versions of the story, to kind of bring them together. But with that, they're also bringing in several different points of view. And so there is a diversity in the story of the flood that we often overlook, because we tend to tell it as one story. I mean, a universal toy that, like, probably of all the stories from Genesis that my kids will recognize, it's this one. Because it more has to do with, we have a Fisher-Price Little People's Noah's Ark, where they got to play with, the animals that go on the boat. They got to shove them inside and that kind of thing. And this is a toy that's like, I think
We always get to see the rainbow, that,
Yeah. Yep. Well, the church that I served in Calgary had an enormous set of stained glass windows. It was 4 large windows, and they were very proud of it. That had the rainbow and Noah's Ark and the animals. But in addition to that, in almost every place in the church that you went, there was a picture of Noah's Ark somewhere. This thematically was very much part of the culture of St. Matthew's United Church in Calgary, was this image of the Ark. And so, like, for some churches, like, it's kind of like, okay, this is our story, and we're gonna run with this one. Whereas in many Presbyterian churches, the story of the burning bush is a common theme. So it's always interesting to see what stories people tend to latch onto.
Oh, well, what about 1925 and yes, and no drinking of alcohol with the yes, that, what was it, the women's
Temperance.
yeah, the temperance one, yes. I mean, that's what I grew up with.
Yep.
Is that there was no drinking. That was
Yep.
What's that?
Yeah, and which is interesting, because
Yes.
there's not. Sorry, go ahead, Marilyn.
No, I just said there's the Lord. Yeah, there was wine, and was represented monthly. You talk about the wine and the bread, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we do know that Jesus drank wine, but there became other. I mean, the temperance movement is a whole other different historical thing that I'm not equipped to talk about tonight. But it is an example of the temperance movement prior to the invention of grape juice didn't exist. Like there are some efforts of refraining from things like that, but there are other examples of particularly in some of the Thanksgiving rituals, is go have a party, drink as much wine as you want. I mean, Jesus, turned water into wine. You know, and it's interesting to see that there's some theological, especially amongst temperance people, looking at the story of looking at the story of Cana and to say that in fact what Jesus did was when he turned water into wine, it wasn't actually alcoholic wine. And what you have to understand is that there was no concept of non-alcoholic wine in that period. It wasn't until the Welch company developed a technology to have grape juice that wasn't fermented.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it just,
So there's an interesting little bit for you. That having been said, the temperance movement did properly recognize the dangers of alcoholism and the like, which we should never overlook. And that kind of thing. But again, that's a hydra I'm not willing to slay tonight, because every time I take a head, there's more questions that come back to that. And we're dealing with the flood.
Okay, just back to Genesis here now. We've got Genesis 8:13.
Yep.
By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the
Yeah.
water had dried up from the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we got them on that ark for 601 years.
Yeah. No. Well,
about
in
stories that are-
yeah.
I don't think so.
We
Like-
need to make a story that is, makes sense and it's simple.
Yeah.
And in our church.
Yeah, and I mean in this particular case, it depends on the translation. Like the one that I had, it says in the 601st year,
Okay.
in the first month on the first day of the month. So some of them imply that, well, Noah was 600 years old at this particular point in time, whereas the translation that I have just seems to be in the 600th year of some dating system that they use.
Yes, you have to read
and
into this stuff, don't you? You have to read.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
and so I mean, as I said last week, do take the ages presented in Genesis, especially with a grain of salt. Actually, a salt lick right about this big. But the thing is, exaggeration of ages was not uncommon at all in any of the literature of the time. I said, there was at least one of the Mesopotamian kings was reported to have been 20,000 years old, which actually makes the biblical ones look pretty modest. And we have archaeological evidence that he didn't live that long, or even remotely close to that long. He might have. I mean, one could arguably say that Queen Elizabeth is a million years old, because truthfully, she's been queen for longer than most of us have been alive.
Yes.
So, or at least she's been alive for longer than most of us, but she's certainly been the only monarch that I've known in my lifetime. And I mean, my mother remembers seeing her in a parade not too long before she ascended to the throne. And so there's that sort of time frame. But so I mean, the big thing is, don't get too hung up on the dates in and of itself. The main things to remember is the story of the flood. Ultimately, God is in control. In many ways, the flood stories may actually be pointing back to some sort of ancient historical event that was localized. And it was a way for people to make some theological sense of it, and so it becomes that making theological sense of the world, or making sense of the world around it. People did it through theological means, not through scientific inquiry, because that method of understanding is a post-enlightenment thing, which only is about, really is only about 300 years old. So, you know, do keep that in mind. That kind of framework was just simply not even on the not in the cards at the time. So, any other questions? We're about 20 after 8 or so.
No, no.
Okay.
So what's next?
So up next, so in 2 weeks
Well, I'm gonna
time.
ask a question about in chapter 9.
Oh, okay.
I think we're allowed to go to chapter 9.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely allowed to go to chapter 9.
So, and God blessed Noah and his sons
Mhm.
and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
Yes.
The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and be upon every bird of the air, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into the hand they are delivered. And that basically you can eat everything too. But in
Yeah.
other areas of the Bible, it says, you know, that they have to be afraid of these beasts around them. So I'm wondering what the etiological purpose of putting that in is.
Well, good point. No,
Don't be afraid. I've got all these animals around you too. Like,
well, in essence, I will, and I will, it also implies like this. You're just looking at the like the opening part, the opening part of that, and you know, one of the things is that you know, and here I'm kind of leaning a little bit more into you know, humanity as a whole. We are the apex predators of on Earth. That even though like tigers and high degree generally we refer to them as dangerous animals. Generally, it sort of explains why some animals aren't so keen on being around people. That may be one of the explanations on it. That, you know, like we are by function natural predators, but we've also in this case there's also the added, in essence, the license to domesticate, so to speak. You know, how is it that as humans we're the only species that has successfully or for the most part has domesticated animals? Now, there's evidence that ladybugs, for example, have actually domesticated aphids. But for the most part,
I didn't hear that.
That ladybugs have domesticated aphids.
They eat them.
Well, they eat them, but apparently they also farm them. That, you know, that they create environments where aphids will grow and then eat them. But I mean, we do the same with cows. You know, and so that may be in reference for that, but it also might help understand as to why, say, for example, my son approaches a cat, the cat will run away from them. You know, never mind that he's loud and terrifying to a cat, never mind a bird.
Would it, oops,
Oh, there's Betty. Hi, Betty.
yes.
Hmm?
Would it also reiterate the creation story where God gave man dominance over the animals?
Yes, and actually you raise an interesting point that chapter 9 is probably from a similar era to the writing of Genesis chapter 1.
mm-hmm.
And so with the, like you picked up, there is this deliberate deliberate echo: be fruitful and multiply. In essence, it's echoing that same thing from Genesis chapter 1, which we will get to the three sessions from now. And And good on you for Betty on noting that point, because
Yeah.
that link and that what we have is something that it draws that theological theme, like keeps pulling that forward. But also the language is very similar to that, and therefore, from a time frame point of view, probably is on a similar dating, a similar era. So what you have here in chapter 9 is a later theological reflection on the story of the flood,
Mhm.
and that's the clue. So thank you for that, Betty.
One other thing, can we go back to the rainbow?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, my impression of the rainbow is that it's not a bow, that it's a circle.
Well, okay. Here's the thing. The rainbow, as a phenomenon, is actually a circle. If you've ever seen a rainbow flying from aircraft and looking down, it is a full circle. But keep in mind, at the time, the cultures who observed this, there was never a point at which they could observe it from up high, look down, and realize that it was an entire circle. They would only ever see it as a bow, or if they were really lucky on a very bright day, they would actually see a double rainbow.
How do you see a circle, Betty?
Because when you have the sun shining through moisture, it goes like this. It just doesn't go like this. The
Mhm.
sun is round.
Yep. The best place to observe that is if you're in an airplane flying above clouds that are not too far away from the airplane, and if you can look out the window and at the shadow and look at the shadow of the airplane, because if the sun is, you see it most if the sun is high in the air, and you look down at the shadow of the airplane on the clouds, you can actually see a rainbow, a full circle rainbow around it. It's really neat to see. So yes, like from a light, from
It was
a
actually
scientific
there was one in Qualicum Beach today. If you look
Mhm.
on the Weather Network,
Mhm.
on what they post on Instagram,
Yep.
you will look and you will see this beautiful
Big
totally round.
circle.
It could be
In-
a circle-ish.
Yeah, she explained it.
Yeah.
Yeah, on different
Yeah.
terms. Yes,
Well,
and it's very rare.
Yeah, I mean, there is one way to see that. Like, you can't necessarily see it from the ground, because the bow will almost always intersect the ground from where the light perspective is. But if you get a drone and look through the camera of a drone and put that drone up high, it'll be a circle.
But they saw it in Qualicum Beach from the ground.
Interesting.
Mhm.
If you can find this picture, I'd like to see it.
It was yesterday.
Yeah.
I wonder-
Now,
yeah.
was another possibility is, were they on the beach looking out across the water, or were they on a one of the
Yep.
higher points in Qualicum looking back out?
No, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was taken from the shores, I thought. And
Okay.
yeah, the weather person would have it for you. Yeah.
Okay, so it's on
Yeah.
so it's on the weather. I will look that up and have a good look at it. But
Yeah,
the thing is, going back to that, yes, rainbows are in fact circles, but from the perspective of people who would have perceived them at the time, they would only appear as a bow.
yeah, but this wasn't a rainbow, was it?
No, it was
just a plain circle above a circle. It showed it, yeah, it was
Yeah, well-
really weird, yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's a phenomenon that I would see, and like, we're totally off topic here, but there's a phenomenon that I would see in Calgary a lot, particularly on very cold days, called a sundial.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what happens is if you look more or less at the sun directly, you can see a spectrum, effectively a rainbow that's a circle around the sun. And sometimes as part of that, there's two almost like subsets of suns that are side by side that happen on the arc itself.
Can you see that?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look at that and see that, because
What does it
that-
say, Cheryl? Where?
I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it?
I can see it.
yeah, I can see that.
And where
sure.
did you bring that up from
Instagram from Global BC.
Global BC?
Okay, Cheryl, would you be able? Can you email that to me? Because I'm gonna guess there may be a double reflection involved in that, where you're actually getting the rainbow, but you're also getting something reflected off the water.
She talked about the sun dogs too, when she was
They say
talking about.
very, very rare optical phenomenon spotted over Qualicum Beach. It is believed to be a parhelix circle caused by the refraction of the sun's light off hexagonally shaped ice crystals in the atmosphere.
Yeah, yeah, that is almost exactly the definition of a sundog.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
That was
so
just my mind wandering.
Oh no, but the thing is, with something like this, mind wandering is part and parcel of it, because especially when you have something like this, that really has been for many of us, a childhood story. I mean, is trying to come to different understandings, to realize that there's actually a whole bunch of layers to the story of the flood, the story of Noah. And I mean, and it's something that actually transcends cultures. But coming to how our faith tradition understands something that may go back as far as the end of the Ice Age is quite intriguing. As to how things are told, and like assuming this story would have been told orally for 3,000 years before it even hit a written form.
Yeah. And in how many various languages and,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting to track, because I mean, of course, the oldest written language that's out there is Sumerian, and in terms of something like that, and its earliest record is about 4,000 years ago. And so even then, the story was old when it entered into the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, which I mean, it's a neat thing to see of how this is interconnected together. So 2 weeks from now, we're jumping forward to chapter 2, the second half of verse 4, to the end of to the very beginning of chapter 4. One of the things is you might kind of wonder is like, okay, well, shouldn't we just deal with like chapter? What you have to understand is, and what most of us forget, is that the chapters in the Bible were not. They didn't, when these texts were put together, these chapter and verse did not exist. That the chapter and verse is a much later convention that was developed to help us get onto the same page, or at least to the same verse. It was a convention later established. So, if, say, for example, you went to a Christian living in the early 2nd century and said John chapter 3, John 3:16, they would have no idea what you were talking about. You couldn't go up to Paul and have him say, hey, can you Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 says this about the sons of says this about the sons of God. What does that mean? He wouldn't know what you're referring to but if you quoted it to him, then it would be because that's how they did that. Because you never find a point at which Paul says, in Genesis chapter, like in Genesis chapter 2, or something like that. But what he does say, for all in Adam die, for example. And in fact, sort of segueing back into the story of Genesis chapter 2, or more specifically chapter 3, we get into the fun thing about this original sin. And I'm going to leave it with that. So I'm going to actually.
Do you have anything specific you want us to look for in those verses?
What I would say is pay particular attention to what is actually in the text and what we think is in the text.
Ah.
Okay.
Literally.
And so pay attention to that. And more more specifically around the serpent.
About what?
We're going to be talking about the serpent.
Serpent, okay.
Okay, pay attention to the serpent. All right.
Okay.
Oh, the serpent. Oh, the snake.
Nightmares.
Well, anyway, we're gonna pay attention to that. But we'll kind of get into that. I'm gonna stop recording now because I think I'm hitting